The argument from undesigned coincidences is an argument which is used in tandem with a series of other arguments to present a holistic argument which concludes that the four canonical Gospels represent a generally historically accurate picture of the life and deeds of Jesus. This argument was used historically by Christian apologists such as William Paley and J.J. Blunt, but fell out of use in contemporary Christian apologetics until rather recently. Lydia McGrew served to revive the argument within contemporary apologetics with the publication of her 2017 book, Hidden in Plain View. The argument has, of course, sparked a reaction from many skeptics. Most recently, relative to the time at which I am making this video, the most significant attempt to refute the argument has come from Dr. Jeff Tripp on Derek Lambert's channel, MythVision. This video has been cited by many in the online skeptic community as being some sort of decisive refutation of the argument. Now, I would have liked to make a video defending the argument from undesigned coincidences from Dr. Tripp's criticisms. However, after seeing how badly Tripp has misunderstood the argument, and by extension how widespread the misunderstandings of the argument have circulated online, I thought I would try doing something a bit different. For those who want to see a direct refutation of Tripp by Lydia McGrew herself, I will link to a video which she did on exploring reality in the comments below. But in this video, I'm going to take a bit of a different path. Rather than defend the argument from the extremely misguided criticisms which it has faced heretofore, I will instead sketch a strategy for what a successful refutation of this argument would actually look like. I must admit that the title of this video is somewhat misleading. I am personally persuaded that the argument from undesigned coincidences is a good argument for the historical reliability of the Gospels. As such, I do not think that the response to the argument which I will sketch here can actually be successfully completed, but I am offering it to skeptics in the hopes that, by seeing what it would take to successfully invalidate the argument from undesigned coincidences, they will better understand the argument from undesigned coincidences. Before sketching what a successful response to the argument from undesigned coincidences might look like, I first need to give a brief overview of how the argument works. By seeing the structure of the reasoning which underlies the argument, we will be better positioned to see how the conclusion is being drawn and what it will take to invalidate that conclusion. As I see it, the argument from undesigned coincidences consists in basically three steps. The first is empirical, and the latter two are explanatory. The first step is to establish that undesigned coincidences actually exist within the Gospels. The term undesigned often causes confusion, but once it is properly understood within the context of the argument, this should be the least controversial step in the argument. I will expand upon this point more in a moment. The second step is to explain the phenomenon of undesigned coincidences. The presence of this phenomenon points us to a larger whole lying beyond what can be seen from what is said within any given gospel. Each gospel, in other words, shows us one part of a fuller picture. The analogy of a puzzle has often been given here. Just as interlocking puzzle pieces yield a fuller picture than any particular puzzle piece conveys, so too do undesigned coincidences reveal a fuller understanding of the underlying story. This, too, should be uncontroversial, given the specific character of the undesigned coincidences which we discover in the Gospels. Again, I will explain this more shortly. Finally, the last step is to explain what that fuller picture lying behind the Gospels might be. This is where the real controversy should lie. The proponent of the argument from undesigned coincidences wants to argue that the best explanation for that underlying story, which is being conveyed only in part through each individual gospel, is that the Gospels are describing real historical events. The skeptic of the argument, if they accept the first two steps, needs to offer a better explanation than historicity for what the big picture is. Ultimately, this video will offer a rough sketch of what I think that such an explanation would look like. But again, I hasten to add that I do not think that such an explanation can actually be given, which is consistent with the full range of undesigned coincidences which we actually encounter in the Gospels. That is why I ultimately take the argument to be successful. Nevertheless, understanding what a successful refutation of the argument would look like, if indeed one could be given, will, I hope, yield a stronger understanding of this argument than its critics seem to currently possess. Okay, so now that we have a fairly good understanding of the logic which undergirds the argument from undesigned coincidences, let's take a closer look at why the first and second step should be granted. But first, what is an undesigned coincidence? Well, very broadly, an undesigned coincidence refers to a casual relation between two or more statements which yields a greater understanding of both or all. Lydia McGrew explains, an undesigned coincidence is a notable connection between two or more accounts of texts which doesn't seem to have been planned by the person or people giving the accounts. Two things about this understanding deserve immediate emphasis: illumination and casualness. Illumination is important because that is the bigger picture behind what is revealed in a single text. This illumination often occurs by way of explanation. For example, one gospel might puzzle a reader, leading them to ask certain questions which are never answered by that gospel. However, those very questions might indirectly be answered in the narrative of another gospel. This is the sort of phenomenon which I am calling illumination. It must be emphasized that these sorts of connections between the texts is casual. This casualness is what is being referenced as undesigned. I highlight this point because skeptics of this argument are swift to point out that the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are literarily dependent upon one another, and an increasing number of scholars are even beginning to think that the author of the Gospel of John also knew the synoptics. So they ask, how can we say that anything in the Gospels is undesigned? This is why the coincidences must be casual. They must be incidental details, the sorts of things which are easily glossed over or missed altogether. This point is important because if a later gospel writer were trying to expand upon the story of an earlier gospel or to answer some looming questions raised by an earlier gospel, then these are deliberate choices on the part of the later author. If the author of, say, Luke were attempting to answer a question raised by the narrative in, say, Matthew, then he is going to be very clear about that. He will have made the answer obvious in the text and made some effort to ensure that his readers do not miss it. He is not going to bury it within the text so as to be easily missed. This is why the presence of literary dependence among the Gospels is not, by itself, a problem for the argument from undesigned coincidences. It is precisely because these connections between the texts don't appear to be deliberate and don't appear to be consciously concerned with the relevant portion of the other text which they are illuminating that they are deemed to be undesigned. The connection is very casual and easy to miss. They do not look like the authors were aware that any illumination of a previous text was taking place. As Peter Williams explains, in an undesigned coincidence, writers show agreement of a kind that is hard to imagine as deliberately contrived by either author to make the story look authentic. Often the agreement is so subtle and indirect that all but the most careful reader are likely to miss it. So now that we understand what an undesigned coincidence is supposed to be, we can ask the question, are there any undesigned coincidences within the Gospels? The answer seems to be a resounding yes. I will only offer a brief sample here, but interested viewers are referred to Lydia McGrew's book for a more thorough discussion, showcasing the full range of undesigned coincidences. One example of an undesigned coincidence occurs between the stories of the feeding of the 5,000 in Mark 6:30 and 31 and John 6:1-4. In Mark 6 we read, "The apostles gathered together with Jesus, and they reported to him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, 'Come away by yourselves to a secluded place and rest a little while.' For there were many people coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat." Of interest to us is the short remark at the end where we read that many were coming and going. It's the sort of thing which the casual reader might easily gloss over and not even think about. Nevertheless, we can ask, why is it that many were coming and going? The answer is found in John 6:4, where, when discussing the same event, John says, "Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was near." The statement that the Passover was near in John serves to explain why it was that many were coming and going in Mark. By reading the two texts together, we get a fuller picture of what was going on than we would by reading only Mark or John. Moreover, the explanation is very casual. John does not appear to be attempting to explain why many were coming and going, since he does not even mention that detail. As such, this is a good example of an undesigned coincidence. As McGrew observes, the correspondence here is so indirect that there can be no question that it is undesigned. Mark does not mention the Passover, and John does not mention the general bustle on the western side of the Sea of Galilee. This detail in John 6:4 creates a further undesigned coincidence with another detail later on in Mark 6, namely Mark's casual statement that the grass was green. Now, that grass should be green is hardly surprising to most of us, but that's because most of us are not familiar with the flora of Palestine. The grass in this region is typically not green, which is why Mark's mentioning this detail is not an instance of him stating the obvious. In fact, the grass in this region is only green immediately after winter in the spring, which just so happens to be when the Jews celebrate the Passover. So the statement in John 6:4 that the Passover was near indirectly confirms the statement in Mark 6:39 that the grass was green. The two texts thus yield a fuller picture of the event than one would have by reading either gospel in isolation. Moreover, this occurs in a casual way, such that John does not appear to be attempting to explain why the grass was green. As a final example, consider an undesigned coincidence which occurs between Matthew 14:1-2 and Luke 8:1-3. The text in Matthew occurs after Herod has executed John the Baptist. The verses read, "At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the news about Jesus and said to his servants, 'This is John the Baptist. He himself has been raised from the dead.'" Matthew makes the odd comment that Herod said this to his servants. A question arises as to why Matthew would specify that this remark was spoken to the servants. He doesn't expand upon this, nor is it necessary for the story. It's not as though Matthew is trying to introduce a dialogue between Herod and his servants, or trying to introduce the servants as characters within the gospel. The servants are never mentioned again. And if we accept that Matthew the tax collector really was the author of the gospel, a further question arises as to how Matthew could have possibly known what Herod privately said to his servants. After all, Matthew did not live in Herod's house, so he certainly could not have witnessed this event. In an entirely different context in Luke, however, we get a plausible answer to both of these questions. In Luke 8:1-3, Luke makes the very casual remark that Joanna, the wife of Chusa, Herod's steward, was a follower of Jesus. If someone that closely affiliated with Herod's servants really was a follower of Jesus, then there is a ready explanation for how Matthew obtained this information, as well as for why it is that Matthew specifies that Herod made this statement to his servants. We see a larger picture emerging from the two Gospels. Moreover, it emerges so casually that the authors of the Gospels appear to be unaware that they are even drawing that larger picture. Neither of them draws the reader's attention to this larger picture. As McGrew concludes, "The indirectness of this coincidence is particularly lovely. Only one part of the puzzle is found in each gospel, and the connection cannot possibly be the result of design. It is beyond belief that Luke would have inserted this casual reference to Chusa in a list unconnected in any other way with Herod or with the beheading of John, in order to provide a convenient explanation for the detail about Herod's servants mentioned only in Matthew." Having established that there are examples of undesigned coincidences, we can ask why these sorts of explanatory relations exist. Now, if there were just a few examples, say only 5 or 6, then they could be brushed aside as being genuine coincidences. After all, if enough people write about the same topic, even if it's fiction, given enough opportunities, there will eventually be some unintentionally interesting connections between and among their writings just by sheer chance. This is not all that surprising, and it's not all that difficult to explain as being purely accidental. However, in the case of the Gospels, we are dealing with dozens upon dozens of these connections. It does not seem likely that this number of connections between the texts is going to occur by chance if the authors are just making things up as they go along. But perhaps the explanation lies in the fact that the Gospel authors know one another's writings. After all, they aren't making these stories up out of nothing. They are working with and integrating each other's stories. If the Gospels were all independent of one another, then all of these connections would be very surprising and would suggest that something more is going on. but we know that they are not completely independent. So perhaps the questions which are raised in certain Gospels also suggested themselves to later Gospel writers, and so they decided to answer some of them in their versions of the stories. Now, this might work in some instances when there is a discernible chronological trajectory of explanation running in the direction in which the Gospels were written. So let's assume, for the sake of argument, that the Gospels were written in the following order: Mark, Matthew, Luke, John. Now suppose that Matthew only added illumination into stories told by Mark, and Luke only provided illumination into stories told by Mark and Matthew, and John only supplied illumination into stories told by the synoptics. There is a clear one-way direction to the undesigned coincidences in this case, running in the same direction as the chronology of the Gospels, and this could suggest that the coincidences have arisen as a direct result of a later Gospel writer redacting earlier Gospels. Those familiar with this channel will know that I don't personally accept that this is the correct chronological order of the Gospels, but that doesn't matter here. The point is just that if a discernible one-way order can be discovered among the undesigned coincidences, and if that order is consistent with the chronological order in which the Gospels were written, such that exclusively later Gospels are illuminating earlier Gospels, then this may suggest a purely literary explanation for the phenomenon. But this is just not the case. What we actually find is that John explains things in the Synoptics, and the Synoptics explain things in John. Mark explains things in Matthew and Luke, and Matthew and Luke explain things in Mark. Matthew explains things in Mark and Luke, and Mark and Luke explain things in Matthew. Luke explains things in Mark and Matthew, and Mark and Matthew explain things in Luke. The pattern of undesigned coincidences which emerges is not a one-way trajectory consistent with the chronological order of the writing of the Gospels, but rather a crisscross pattern with undesigned coincidences running in all directions. This rules out editorial redaction as being the sole explanation for undesigned coincidences, because, in fact, there are earlier Gospels which are likewise illuminating later Gospels. Clearly, earlier Gospels could not have been redacting later Gospels, since the later Gospels had not yet been written at the time at which the earlier Gospels were composed. And it seems extraordinarily unlikely that later Gospels were deliberately leaving certain issues hanging because they were aware that the earlier Gospels already dealt with them. In all likelihood, each Gospel writer expected that their singular Gospel would be the only Gospel which most of their readers would ever see. They were probably not anticipating the canonization of all four Gospels together for easy cross-referencing. As McGrew points out, acknowledging some degree of literary dependence among the Synoptic Gospels is by no means the same thing as granting that the later ones tack on non-factual material as they go. Nor does it mean that the differences among them are due to redactive manipulation of earlier material as opposed to differences in eyewitness perspective. In short, it doesn't matter to the historicity of the Gospels whether, for example, Mark was written first and Matthew and Luke got some of their material from Mark. Even if that is true, it doesn't mean that Matthew and Luke developed from Mark in an evolutionary fashion, or that Matthew and Luke did not have reliable, independent information of their own. So if blind luck and literary dependence are insufficient to explain the amount of and pattern of undesigned coincidences which we find in the Gospels, we are forced to consider another option, namely that there is a singular source lying behind the parts of the story which we are glimpsing in the text of the Gospels. I leave open at this stage in the argument what that singular source might be. The only conclusion that I am drawing right now is that there is in fact a fuller story lying behind the stories which are contained in the Gospels. This is a significant conclusion, but it is one which we seemed forced by the data to accept. So having argued that there are actually undesigned coincidences in the Gospels, and having argued that the sheer number of them, as well as the crisscross pattern which they form, force us to accept a greater whole behind the Gospels, we are now in a position to take the final step in the argument and infer that the best explanation of the evidence is that the Gospels are historically trustworthy. We have concluded that there is a fuller source behind the Gospels. We may now ask, what is that source? Well, one possibility is that there is some lost gospel which was substantially more detailed than our four Gospels, and from which all four drew their information. Certainly, this would be an adequate explanation for the evidence. It would explain why there are so many undesigned coincidences, and it would explain why they crisscross across the four Gospels in all directions, since, on this hypothesis, there is a singular source from which we only get portions in our canonical Gospels. But while logically possible, this is not a very good explanation of the evidence. In the first place, we lack completely any independent evidence for such a gospel. Certainly, such a detailed gospel would have been highly regarded by the early Christians. Yet we find neither manuscript evidence for such a gospel, nor even a mention of it in early Christian writings. We are expected to believe that the early Christians meticulously preserved Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, despite the fact that they all only contained part of the story, but then they left the full story to be lost without so much as a passing reference. I find that extremely implausible. A much better explanation is that the fuller story just is the actual events of history. The ultimate source of the information is the events themselves. The Gospels, on this hypothesis, are simply reporting what really happened. This hypothesis explains why there are so many undesigned coincidences throughout the Gospels, as well as the crisscross pattern which they form. Moreover, it does not suffer from the same shortcomings as the previous hypothesis, because it does not require us to accept the existence of some other hypothetical gospel. And so the idea that the Gospels represent accurate historical reportage emerges as being the best explanation of the phenomenon known as undesigned coincidences. That, in essence, is a condensed version of the argument. There are undesigned coincidences. This phenomenon points us to a fuller reality behind the Gospels, and real historical events function as the best explanation of that fuller reality. So now that I have given a broad overview of the basic argument, let me explain how I think that the skeptic can, in principle, get around it. I call this the divide and conquer approach. The basic idea is that, by reducing the number of undesigned coincidences to be explained via compartmentalization, one greatly lessens the overall evidential impact of the argument. As McGrew herself admits, this is a cumulative argument. The idea behind cumulative arguments is that, by adding together several small pieces of evidence which don't carry a lot of force on their own, they collectively pack a bigger punch. By the same logic, then, to the extent that one can lessen the number of pieces of evidence which need to be explained, one will be able to reduce the cumulative force of the argument. I suspect that most skeptics of the argument from undesigned coincidences don't want to take this approach because it requires them to do a lot of work. Nevertheless, I am persuaded that it is the only strategy which could, in principle, succeed. If I were a skeptic, I would begin by sorting through the various examples of undesigned coincidences to categorize them. To build a robust alternative theory, one is going to have to be able to account for the full range of undesigned coincidences. I think that the skeptic can categorize undesigned coincidences into basically 5 categories. First, undesigned coincidences which are easy to reject. Second, undesigned coincidences which appear in clearly literarily dependent pericopes. Third, undesigned coincidences which appear within the commonly accepted chronological trajectory of the writing of the Gospels. Fourth, undesigned coincidences which betray knowledge of the times, but yield no greater insight into any particular event. And then finally, leftover undesigned coincidences. Let's take a closer look at each of these categories. The first category tries to trim the fat, as it were. It tries to remove as many putative examples of undesigned coincidences as possible right from the start. There are many ways to do this. One might try to show that a putative undesigned coincidence depends upon a dubious reading of one of the Gospels. For example, one might reject the first example which McGrew gives in her book, since it depends upon John the Baptist's statement in John 1:30 that Jesus was before him, as being a witticism on the part of John the Baptist, knowing as he did that he himself had actually been born before Jesus, as per Luke 1:36. So according to McGrew, we can make sense of John the Baptist's witticism in John 1:30 if Luke 1:36 is actually historical. However, it seems to me that one might just as easily interpret this statement in light of John's prologue as merely being a reference to Jesus' eternal pre-existence and nothing else. Nothing in the context of John's Gospel really suggests that John the Baptist was intending to be witty here. And indeed, unless we suppose that John the Baptist's audience was aware that John was 6 months older than Jesus, there is no real reason to think that they would have caught the pun, which mitigates against the idea that John was intending to make one. Minimally, there is room for reasonable disagreement here. Similarly, one might reject McGrew's ninth example, since it depends upon the antecedent of the demonstrative pronoun these in John 21:15, referring to the disciples as opposed to, say, the 153 fish, which symbolically represent the life to which Peter had returned after denying Jesus. Either understanding of the pronoun is possible given the context. This first category is an important one for the skeptic because it allows them to reduce the evidential force of undesigned coincidences right from the start. So let's say that there are 50 putative undesigned coincidences. If the skeptic can reject, or at least cast doubt on 10 of them right from the start, then they will have reduced the evidential impact of the argument proportionately. Now, the argument only stands on 40 examples of undesigned coincidences instead of 50. The argument becomes weaker. Now again, I am not saying that the skeptic actually will be able to legitimately reject 20% of the putative examples of undesigned coincidences. I'm merely giving a hypothetical illustration to show viewers the sort of work which this first category would be doing in undercutting the overall argument. The second category attempts to remove undesigned coincidences, which can be easily explained by one gospel author copying from another. For example, one might think that McGrew's 19th example fits into this category. In this example, John and Luke both say that Joseph of Arimathea buried Jesus in a new tomb, but they don't mention that the tomb belongs to him, raising the question as to why Joseph felt free to bury Jesus in the new tomb. Only Matthew supplies the detail that Joseph himself owns the tomb. But the curious point here is that Mark also does not mention that Joseph owns the tomb. So, on the assumption of Markan priority, the skeptic could maintain that this question also suggested itself to Matthew's mind when he came across this story in Mark. Matthew then supplied the detail that Joseph owned the tomb so that the story would make sense. Conversely, the question just didn't arise for the authors of Luke and John, and so both authors, following Mark, left that detail out. Now the skeptic has to be careful here. Remember, the casualness of these undesigned coincidences is what is mitigating against deliberate illumination or explanation. So the skeptic cannot just toss out any undesigned coincidence which appears in a later gospel. He can only toss out the ones for which there is an evident motive for the later redactor to add the illuminating information. In cases of undesigned coincidences where such an explanation is not readily available, it seems to me that the skeptic is best served by saying that the illumination is caused unconsciously by the later writer having some idea in his own mind of what was going on in the narrative based upon his reading of the earlier gospel. Since the later gospel writer is subconsciously aware of the events in earlier gospels as he imagines them, he might insert details into his own narrative which reflect or betray that understanding. In this scenario, there is indeed a fuller story behind the writing of a later gospel, which has been informed by earlier gospels, just as the proponent of the argument from undesigned coincidences maintains. But this fuller story is contained not in the events of history, but in the imagination of the later gospel writer. Such an explanation could also possibly take a set of undesigned coincidences off the table, particularly those which occur in the same stories in various Gospels where literary dependence is known to exist. The third category is, I think, going to be the most important for the skeptic. This category identifies directionality in undesigned coincidences. The idea here is that the skeptic outlines a basic synoptic theory to see how many undesigned coincidences can be explained via editorial redaction, with later Gospels illuminating stories or explaining details in earlier Gospels. As already noted, These sorts of undesigned coincidences, which run in a single direction, could, in principle, be explained by recourse to redaction. The skeptic can toss out any examples which can plausibly be explained by recourse to deliberate redaction by the author of a later gospel. This will actually probably get a decent number of undesigned coincidences off the table. So an illustration here might be McGrew's 15th example. In this case, she argues that Jesus' use of the phrase, drink of the cup, in John 18:11 is corroborated by Jesus' use of the same phrase at an earlier point in the narratives of the synoptics, suggesting that this was a phrase which Jesus commonly used. However, if one thinks that John knows the synoptics, then one might just as easily think that the author of John's Gospel has co-opted the phrase from the synoptics and inserted it here rather than bearing independent testimony to Jesus' use of it. The fourth category admits that an undesigned coincidence does betray the historicity of certain generic customs discussed within the Gospels, but denies that it is specific enough to confirm the historicity of the particular events being described. A potential illustration here is McGrew's third example. In this instance, the empty water pots described in John 2:1-7, which had presumably been emptied for washing prior to a meal, are confirmed as a realistic cultural feature of the time by Mark 7:1-5. This certainly shows that the author of John inadvertently demonstrates familiarity with ancient Jewish culture, but it doesn't really confirm any particular historical details surrounding the wedding in Cana. Hopefully at this point you are starting to see why I refer to this as the divide and conquer strategy. By finding various ways to discount various specific examples of undesigned coincidences, the skeptic is able to proportionally lessen the overall force of the argument. There is, however, a fifth category, namely the leftovers, the undesigned coincidences which don't fit into any of the previous four categories. In theory, the skeptic will be able to place enough of the undesigned coincidences into one of the previous four categories to end up with only a few leftovers at the end. And then he can just admit that while this may be some slight evidence for the historicity of the Gospels, it ultimately isn't enough to override the evidence against their reliability, or something like that. One shortcoming in this approach should also be noted, namely that many of these categories for explaining away undesigned coincidences will not work for undesigned coincidences between the book of Acts and the epistles of Paul. This is because there is no literary dependence at play here, at least not of the same type as is present among the synoptic gospels. So to the extent that the divide and conquer approach works at all, it will only work to explain away undesigned coincidences within the gospels. The problem with this approach, at least for me, is that when I try to categorize the putative examples of undesigned coincidences under these 5 headings, I end up with way too many leftovers to say that undesigned coincidences have a negligible evidential value. And that is why I ultimately think that the argument from undesigned coincidences is a good argument for the historical reliability of the Gospels. But I think that skeptics of this argument would do better to pursue the general sort of divide and conquer strategy which I have set forward in this video, than to attempt to find a handful of undesigned coincidences in other fictional texts, or claim that the argument is guilty of circular reasoning and such. So perhaps this video will give them a launching pad. The purpose of this video has merely been to outline the form that a successful response to the argument from undesigned coincidences would have to take. My hope has been that this will help skeptics of the argument to better understand the argument.